Rachel Reeves stood in the middle of the Red Lantern Saloon with rainwater dripping from her black widow's bonnet and the sheriff's hand clamped around her arm. Every card player had gone still. Every glass had stopped halfway to a mouth. Sheriff Titus Grange had just called her a thief before the whole town, saying her dead husband's debt would be paid with her wedding ring, her wagon, and whatever dignity she had left. Then Charles Laramie rose from the back table, tall and quiet as a storm cloud, and stepped between the sheriff and the widow no one dared defend. "Take your hand off her," he said, and the room learned that courage did not always shout. Sometimes it stood alone. "Before we open the door to this dusty town, tell me your country in the comments. Subscribe if you love Western romances about public shame, unexpected rescue, and hearts that finally come home." The first thing Rachel Reeves noticed was not the sheriff's grip, though it hurt badly enough to leave bruises. It was the silence. The Red Lantern Saloon had never been silent in all the weeks she had lived in Mercy Crossing. Even at dawn, some old miner was coughing over coffee, some teamster was laughing too loud, some fiddle was being tuned by a man too drunk to know the sun had risen. But now, as Sheriff Titus Grange dragged her 3 steps past the swinging doors and into the lamplight, every sound died. The rain outside came down hard on the false front buildings, making the streets shine black and gold. Rachel's hem was soaked. Her shoes were muddy. Her bonnet had slipped crooked over one ear. She had walked nearly 2 miles in the storm because the sheriff's deputy had come to her cabin and said there was business in town that could not wait. She had thought it meant another paper to sign over Jonah's debts. She had thought it meant another humiliation at the bank. She had not thought he would parade her through the saloon. "Look here," Sheriff Grange said, lifting her left hand for all to see. "Widow Reeves says she has no money, says her late husband left her with nothing but sorrow and a broken roof. Yet she keeps gold on her finger like a banker's wife." A few men shifted in their chairs. Nobody spoke. Rachel tried to pull her hand away. "That ring was my mother's. Your mother did not owe Barnaby Holt $180. My mother did not owe anyone anything," Rachel said, her voice thin but steady. The sheriff smiled, and that smile had made many people in Mercy Crossing step backward. Titus Grange was a broad man with a silver badge and pale eyes that looked at poor folks the way a butcher looked at meat. He had been sheriff 6 years, and in those 6 years, no one had won an argument with him unless they had more money, more guns, or more friends. Rachel had none of those. Her husband Jonah Reeves had been dead 3 months, killed under a fallen freight wagon on the North Road. He had left her a leaking cabin, 2 hens, a Bible with pressed flowers inside, and debts she had known nothing about until men began knocking on her door with papers in their hands. Some said Jonah had gambled. Some said Jonah had been cheated. Some said Rachel must have known. The last rumor had found good soil in Mercy Crossing because a widow with no kin was easier to blame than a dead man with no answers. "I will not give you my ring in a saloon," Rachel said. Sheriff Grange leaned close. "You will give it where I tell you to give it." At the back of the room, a chair scraped. The sound was small, but it seemed to travel through every board in the floor. Charles Laramie stood from a table near the stove. He had been sitting alone with a cup of coffee untouched before him, his hat pulled low, his coat dusted with trail mud. Rachel knew him by sight, as everyone did. A rancher from the Western Flats, a widower, some said. A man who had buried a brother, some said. A man who kept to himself and paid in coin. He came to town for salt, feed, and nails, then vanished again toward his stretch of grass under the blue hills. He was not handsome in the polished way of men who looked into mirrors often. His face was wind-browned and steady, with a scar at the jaw and eyes the color of storm water. He looked like a man who had been shaped by long winters and hard choices. He took 1 step forward. "Take your hand off her," Charles said. The sheriff turned slowly. This is county business. I'd stop being county business when you dragged a grieving woman into a saloon to strip her before drunk men. A murmur moved through the room. Rachel felt it brush her like cold air. Sheriff Grange released her hand, but only so he could rest his palm on the butt of his revolver. You calling me dishonorable, Laramie? I am saying what you are doing is dishonorable. No one breathed. Rachel looked at Charles, stunned by the calmness of him. He was not reaching for his gun. He was not swelling up like a rooster. His voice carried no heat, which somehow made it more dangerous. Barnaby Holt, the saloon owner and moneylender, appeared behind the bar with a white towel in his hands. He was a small man with oiled hair and a mouth that never opened unless profit might fall in. Now, we do not need trouble in here. You invited it, Charles said, without looking away from the sheriff. Holt flushed. The sheriff took one step closer to Charles. Widow Reeves owes lawful money. Her husband signed. There are witnesses. Rachel's throat tightened. I never saw those notes. That is not my concern, the sheriff said. It ought to be, Charles replied. Then he reached into his coat and drew out a worn leather purse. He counted coins on the nearest table, each one striking wood like a nail in a coffin. $10, $20. The room watched. Rachel watched too, her shame growing sharper with every coin. When he reached 40, Charles stopped. This pays for 30 days, he said. Food, roof, peace, and time for Mrs. Reeves to see the papers against her. Sheriff Grange sneered. You are buying her trouble? I am buying your silence until the law can be read in daylight, Rachel whispered. Mr. Laramie, please do not. He turned then, and his eyes softened just enough to make her heart hurt. It is not charity, Mrs. Reeves. It is a loan against honest work, if you will allow it. The words gave her a plank to stand on. Not charity, work. Still, the whole town was watching her. The card players, the bartender, the deputy by the door, the girls on the stairs, the old men near the stove. They had seen her pulled in like a criminal. They had seen a stranger pay for her breathing room. Sheriff Grange swept the coins into his palm. 30 days then. But remember, this Widow Reeves. Mercy Crossing has a long memory. Charles picked up his hat. So do men who have been pushed too far. That was the first time Rachel saw Sheriff Grange's confidence flicker. It came and went like lightning, but she saw it. Outside, thunder rolled across the low hills. Charles opened the saloon doors and stood aside. Rachel walked out with her head held as high as she could manage, though tears burned behind her eyes. The rain struck her face like thrown gravel. For one terrible moment, she thought she might break in the street. Then Charles stepped down beside her. My wagon is at the livery, he said. I can take you home. I can walk. In this weather, pride will catch its death. She almost laughed, but the sound came out broken. He did not reach for her. He did not crowd her. He simply stood in the rain, waiting, as if her answer mattered more than the storm. At last, Rachel nodded. Behind them, the Red Lantern's doors swung shut, but the silence they had left inside did not end. It followed every man in that saloon, pressing against his ribs, asking what kind of courage he had failed to show. Charles Laramie's wagon smelled of damp canvas, leather, and hay. Rachel sat on the bench with both hands folded tightly in her lap, afraid that if she loosened them, she would begin shaking and never stop. The rain turned the road to black paste, and the horses leaned into their collars as Charles guided them through the ruts. For a long while, neither spoke. Mercy Crossing faded behind them, its lamps becoming dull yellow beads in the wet dark. Ahead lay the road to Rachel's cabin, a narrow track bordered by sagebrush and stunted cottonwoods. Lightning flashed far off, showing the land in hard white pieces. Fence posts, rocks, the slant of Charles' hat, his hands on the reins. Rachel finally said, "You should not have done that. I have been told that before. You do not understand what Sheriff Grange is." "I understand enough." "No," she said, too sharply. Then she drew a breath. Forgive me. I mean, he does not forget a slight. He will make you pay for speaking to him that way. Charles looked ahead. He has been collecting from frightened people for years. Maybe it is time. Someone paid attention. Rachel turned toward him. You knew. I knew men came into town with full pockets and left with notes they could not read. I knew widows lost hens, blankets, horses, and land over debts that seemed to grow in the dark. I knew your husband owed something. I did not know they had turned the teeth on you. His voice held no pity. Rachel was grateful for that. Pity had become another weight to carry. Jonah made mistakes, she said quietly, but he was not wicked. Charles clicked to the horses as they slowed near a washout. A man can make mistakes and still leave a woman to suffer for them. The truth of that sat between them. Rachel had married Jonah Reeves after 3 letters and 1 train ride west. She had been 24, alone in St. Louis after her mother died, sewing collars for women who never learned her name. Jonah's letters had been clumsy but kind. He had written of a cabin, a garden, Sunday hymns, and a place where a woman could be needed without being owned. For a little while, it had been true. Then work failed. Then rain failed. Then Jonah began riding into town alone. Then his eyes changed. Rachel had not known how much trouble he had found until the men came after his funeral. Her cabin appeared through the rain, dark and crooked under a cottonwood. Charles pulled the wagon close to the porch. One of the shutters banged loose. Water poured through a gap in the roof near the chimney, falling into a pot Rachel had placed on the floor that morning. Charles saw it. Of course he saw it. Rachel climbed down before he could offer his hand. Thank you for the ride. He stepped down after her. Have you eaten today? The question struck harder than the sheriff's grip. She looked away. That is not your concern. No, he said. But it is a simple question. Rachel had eaten half a biscuit at dawn and given the other half to the old mule she could no longer afford to feed. Pride told her to lie. Hunger made the lie too heavy. I have flour, she said. Flour is not supper. It becomes supper when a person has practice. He studied the cabin, the broken shutter, the thin smoke from wet wood, the garden gone to weeds after 3 months of grief and fear. Then he reached into the back of the wagon and lifted down a sack. Rachel stiffened. I told you, I do not take charity. I told you, I offered work. What work? My ranch house has not been kept properly since my housekeeper went to live with her daughter last winter. I have 3 hands who can mend fence, but cannot cook beans without burning the pot. My ledgers are behind. My tack needs stitching. I need someone steady 2 days a week. I will pay fair wage, in coin and supplies if you prefer. Rachel stared at him through the rain. It sounded too neat, too merciful. Mercy made her wary now. Why? She asked. Because you need work and I need help. You do not know if I can do any of that. I know. You stood in a saloon with half the town watching and did not beg. A person who can do that can learn most things. Her eyes filled so suddenly, she had to turn away. Charles did not pretend not to notice. He simply set the sack on the porch, far enough from her feet that she would have to choose to take it. This is an advance, he said. Beans, coffee, salt pork, and a little sugar. Write it down if that helps. I will deduct it from wages unless you tell me otherwise. It does help, she whispered. I thought it might. The storm pressed around them, loud and cold. Rachel wanted to refuse him. She wanted to shut the door and sit hungry beside her leaking roof, because hunger was at least hers. But the image of Sheriff Grange holding up her hand in the saloon burned in her mind. 30 days. That was all Charles had bought her. 30 days to stand. When would you need me? She asked. Tomorrow. If the creek is not up, I can fetch you at sunup. I have my own mule. She looks half-starved. Rachel's pride flared. Her name is Juniper, and she has carried me through worse roads than yours. Charles inclined his head. Then Juniper is welcome too. That small respect undid something in her. She looked at the sack, then at the man who had placed it where she could accept without being handled. "I will work," she said, "but I will pay every cent back. I expect you will. And you will not speak of my hunger. No, and you will not speak of tonight." Charles looked toward the town lights, dim behind the rain. Charles looked toward the town lights, dim behind the rain. "Mrs. Reeves, by morning, all of Mercy Crossing will speak of tonight, but they will not hear it from me." Rachel believed him. The next morning came pale and washed clean. The storm had broken limbs from cottonwoods and left the creek swollen, but the sky opened blue behind ragged clouds. Rachel woke before dawn, pinned up her hair, patched the tear in her sleeve, and made coffee from Charles' advance with hands that trembled from more than hunger. Juniper stood by the fence, chewing slowly, looking offended by the world. By sunup, Charles arrived, not in the wagon, but riding a bay gelding and leading a spare horse. "I thought your mule might prefer a day of rest," he said. "Juniper prefers to be consulted." Then I apologized to Juniper. Rachel nearly smiled. It felt strange on her face. They rode west together, across wet grass shining under the morning sun. Charles kept his pace easy. He did not ask questions meant to pry open her grief. He pointed out where the road dipped, where the clay turned slick, where antelope sometimes crossed. His restraint felt like shelter. The Laramie place sat in a wide valley under blue hills, with a low ranch house of pine logs, a barn, a windmill, and corrals that smelled of hay and horses. Smoke rose from the bunkhouse chimney. 3 ranch hands looked up when Rachel rode in. Their faces showed curiosity, but one glance from Charles lowered their eyes back to work. "This is Mrs. Reeves," Charles said. "She will be helping here. You will treat her with respect." The tallest hand, a red-haired man named Owen Pike, touched his hat. "Yes, sir." The youngest, Billy Shaw, looked embarrassed by the burned black skillet he was holding. Rachel saw the beans inside, hard as pebbles and charred at the bottom. She took the skillet from him. "How long did these cook?" Billy swallowed. "Since yesterday, ma'am." Rachel looked at Charles for the first time since the saloon. A corner of his mouth moved. "You see, my need was not invented." And there, in the doorway of a ranch house that smelled of smoke, dust, and neglect, Rachel Reeves began to earn her place one practical act at a time. Rachel did not make the Laramie Ranch into a home in one day. Homes were not made that way, no matter what sentimental people claimed. Homes were built by repeated motions: a swept floor, a mended cuff, coffee set before sunrise, a lantern trimmed before dark, a door latched against wind, a person learning where another person kept the flour and what silence meant when it settled in the room. The first day, Rachel saved the beans. She soaked a fresh pot, added salt pork, onion, and a pinch of dry pepper she found in a cracked jar. She scraped the skillet clean with sand, boiled coffee strong enough to stand a spoon in, and made biscuits with the careful thrift of a woman who had counted flour by the handful. The ranch hands ate like men rescued from a sentence. Billy Shaw looked near tears over his second biscuit. "Ma'am, I forgot food could taste of anything but smoke." Rachel lowered her eyes, but warmth moved through her chest. Charles ate quietly at the end of the table. He did not praise her loudly. He said, "Good meal," and passed his plate for washing. Somehow that pleased her more than a speech. After breakfast, she found his ledgers in a locked desk he opened without hesitation. The books were a thicket of numbers: feed purchases, cattle counts, wages, and notes from buyers in Abilene. Charles, it turned out, had a hand fit for roping wild horses, but not for writing clean columns. Rachel sharpened a pencil and began setting order to it. She had done accounts for the dressmaker in St. Louis. It was work she understood. Numbers did not pity. Numbers did not gossip. They either balanced or showed where the wound was. By noon, she found 3 mistakes in feed charges and 1 unpaid invoice from a man in town who had claimed payment twice. Charles leaned over the page, Barnaby Holt, I.S. He charged me twice for the same oats. So it seems. Charles' jaw hardened. That man is a rat in a vest. Rachel almost laughed again. This time a small sound escaped. Charles looked at her as if he had been handed something rare. Then he looked away quickly, giving the moment room to breathe. The days settled into a pattern. Twice a week, Rachel rode to the Laramie place. When weather was poor, Charles fetched her. When the creek rose, she stayed overnight in the spare room with a quilt folded on the foot of the bed and a chair wedged under the latch, because Charles had thought of her comfort without making a show of it. She cooked, mended, balanced books, dried herbs, and patched the ranch hand's torn gloves. In return, Charles paid her every Saturday in coin placed in an envelope, with the cost of the advance written plainly and subtracted fairly. The first time she saw the envelope, she had to close her eyes. "What is wrong?" Charles asked. "Nothing. It is only that you wrote it down. You asked me to." Most men remembered what served them. Charles remembered what steadied her. The town noticed. Mercy Crossing noticed everything. It noticed Rachel riding west twice a week. It noticed flour in her pantry again. It noticed her buying nails, lamp oil, and a bolt of blue calico. It noticed Charles Laramie standing behind her at the Mercantile one afternoon when Barnaby Holt suggested, with a smile too oily to be accidental, that some widows found new arrangements quicker than mourning aloud. Charles did not threaten him. He simply placed a sack of feed on the counter and said, "Speak plainly, Holt, so everyone can hear the kind of man you are." Holt went red and pretended to study a receipt. Rachel had gone cold with embarrassment, but later outside, she said, "You cannot fight every person who insults me." "I did not fight him. You made him feel small. He managed that without help." She looked at him then, really looked. He stood beside the hitching rail, one hand resting near his horse's neck, his hat brim shadowing his eyes. There was anger in him, but it was bridled. That mattered. Rachel had seen anger without reins. It had emptied cupboards and broken promises, and left a woman explaining bruises she did not have on her skin. "Why do you care what they say of me?" she asked. Charles took a moment before answering. "Because words become weather in a town. Folks pretend talk is harmless, but enough of it can freeze a person out." Rachel knew that too well. On the ride back to her cabin, she told him a little of St. Louis. Not much, just the dress shop, her mother's cough, the letter from Jonah folded into a sugar bowl. Charles listened. He did not interrupt to tell a larger sorrow of his own. Days later, he told her about his brother Samuel. They were repairing a broken harness in the barn while rain tapped the roof. Rachel stitched the leather with a curved needle. Charles held the strap steady. "Sam was quicker than me," he said. "Quicker, quicker to trust, quicker to fight if someone needed defending." Rachel kept her eyes on the stitch. "Well, died 4 years back." Sorry." Charles nodded. "Sheriff Grange called it a fair shooting," said Sam Drew first. "Did he?" "No. The word was flat as a closed door." Rachel's needle paused. Charles' hands tightened on the leather. "Sam saw Grange take money from a peddler. He said he would tell the territorial judge when circuit court came through. 2 nights later, he was dead behind the feed store with a gun near his hand that was not his." The barn seemed to darken around them. "Why did you stay?" Rachel asked. "Because leaving would have given Grange everything Sam tried to protect." She understood then that Charles' stand in the saloon had not come from sudden gallantry. It had come from a grief buried deep and kept alive by conscience. "I am sorry," she said again, softer. He looked down at her hands stitching his harness. "SOMI. Something passed between them then, quiet and unclaimed. Not romance, not yet. Something more cautious. Recognition. 2 people who had lost the shape of their lives and kept working anyway." By the end of the 3rd week, Rachel's cabin roof no longer leaked, because Charles sent Owen and Billy with shingles and called it payment for extra ledger work. Rachel argued until Owen, grinning, handed her a paper in Charles' handwriting, listing the labor as wages. "He knew you would fuss," Owen said. "I do not fuss." "No, ma'am. You state objections with great dignity." Rachel gave him a look that sent him back up the ladder. When Charles came by that evening, she had coffee waiting. He stood on her repaired porch and looked at the roof as if the sight pleased him. "You sent too much help," she said. "I sent what the job required. I will repay it." "I know." She wanted to ask him in. The want frightened her more than hunger had. A lonely woman had to be careful with warmth. Warmth could become need, and need could become a door someone else locked from the outside. Charles seemed to sense the struggle. He touched his hat. "Good evening, Mrs. Reeves." "Good evening, Mr. Laramie." He rode away under a sky turning violet, and Rachel stood on the porch long after he vanished, one hand resting against the place where her mother's ring still circled her finger. For the first time in months, the ring did not feel like the last proof of what she had lost. It felt like a promise that she had survived. The 30 days Charles had bought were nearly gone when the deeper trouble found its way to Rachel's door. It came in the form of a folded paper, nailed to her porch post with a railroad spike. Rachel found it at dawn. The paper was damp with mist, but the writing was clear. "Notice of Caesar, by order of Sheriff Titus Grange. Property belonging to the estate of Jonah Reeves would be taken and sold to satisfy outstanding debts. Cabin, mule, hens, stove, personal effects of value." At the bottom was Barnaby Holt's signature as claimant. Rachel read it once, then again. Then she sat on the porch step because her knees had forgotten their duty. The paper did not mention the 30 days. It did not mention the right to inspect the notes. It did not mention the coins Charles had paid in front of half the town. It was as if the saloon had never happened. By noon, Rachel rode Juniper to the Laramie ranch with a notice folded in her pocket, and anger burning through her fear. Charles was in the north pasture moving cattle before another storm. She waited at the ranch house, unable to sit, unable to stop touching the paper. When he came in, he saw her face and removed his hat. "What happened?" She handed him the notice. He read it. His expression did not change, but the room seemed to tighten around him. "This is not lawful," he said. "Will that matter?" He looked at her then, and she knew the answer. Law and Mercy Crossing had one face, and it wore Sheriff Grant's badge. Charles took the notice to his desk, unlocked a drawer, and pulled out copies of receipts. "The money I paid bought 30 days. I had Holt sign." Rachel stepped closer. "Then show the judge. The circuit judge is not due for 2 weeks. The notice says Caesar tomorrow." Charles folded the paper carefully. "Then we stop it tomorrow." The simplicity of his words frightened her. Men who spoke of stopping the sheriff often ended up leaving town, buried outside it, or changing their minds before sundown. "I will not have you die over my stove," she said. A faint, sad smile touched his mouth. "I had hoped to amount to more than a stove. This is not a jest. No way." He set the notice down. "It is not." Rachel looked at the locked drawer. Inside, beneath his ranch papers, she glimpsed an old envelope tied with string. The top letter bore Samuel Laramie's name. Charles saw her notice it and closed the drawer, but not sharply. That evening, the storm rolled in early. Rachel stayed because the creek was rising, and Charles made no ceremony of it. He put her in the spare room and slept on a chair near the kitchen stove, though she told him that was foolish. After midnight, thunder shook the windows. Rachel woke to hear voices below. She slipped from bed and opened the door a crack. Charles stood in the kitchen with Owen Pike, both men half-dressed and tense. Owen said, "I heard it straight from Deputy Mills. Grange claims Jonah Reeves carried money for the Cattlemen's Association and lost it gambling. Says Mrs. Reeves helped hide the remainder." Rachel's breath caught. Charles' voice was low. "Jonah never carried association money. Grange has a witness." "Who?" "Barnaby Holt." Silence. Then Owen added, "There is more. Grange says if you interfere tomorrow, he will reopen Samuel's case." Claims he has evidence your brother was part of the same theft. Rachel gripped the doorframe. Charles did not move for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice sounded scraped clean. Sam has been dead for years. That will not stop him from dragging the name through mud. No, Charles said. It would please him. Rachel stepped into the hall. The floor creaked. Both men looked up. She came down the stairs slowly, wrapping her shawl around herself. Tell me the rest. Charles' face closed. You should go back to bed. I have been handled by men, deciding what I should know. Do not join them. The words struck him. He bowed his head once. You are right. Owen excused himself to the bunkhouse, leaving them with the storm. Charles stood by the stove, firelight cutting shadows under his cheekbones. Grange is tying Jonah's debts to a theft that never reached court. If folks believe you hid stolen money, they will not object when he takes your cabin. If I stand with you, he will stain Sam's name to break me. Did your brother have anything to do with it? No. Then truth is truth. Charles looked at her with weary eyes. Truth can be buried if enough men shovel dirt. Rachel knew that too. She had lived under dirt thrown by whispers. She sat at the table. Jonah had a ledger. Charles went still. What ledger? He kept one hidden beneath a loose floorboard. I found it after he died. It had names and numbers. I thought it was gambling debts. I could not bear to read much. I hid it because men kept coming to the cabin. Where is it now? Rachel looked down. In my stove wood box. Charles drew a slow breath. Rachel. It was the first time he had used her given name. The sound of it in his voice nearly undid her. She whispered, I was afraid. I know. If Jonah was part of something wicked, then the ledger might tell us who made him afraid. She looked up. You think he was afraid? I think men like Holt and Grants do not lend money without hooks. Jonah might have owed. He might have been weak. But weak men are useful to wicked ones. The storm rattled the windows. Rachel thought of Jonah's last weeks. The way he had jumped at hoofbeats. The way he had once burned a letter before she could read the seal. The way he had taken her face in both hands the night before he died and said, if something happens, trust no one with a badge. She had thought grief made the memory strange. Now it returned sharp as a blade. At dawn, they rode to her cabin together through mud and gray light. Charles carried a rifle, not in threat, but in readiness. Rachel's hands shook as she lifted the wood from the box and pulled out the oilcloth-wrapped ledger. It was small, brown, and swollen from years of handling. Charles did not take it from her. He let her open it. Inside were names, dates, amounts, initials, payments made to TZ and BH, beside debts charged to farmers, widows, freighters, and ranch hands. Some pages listed seized goods sold privately, a silver watch, 2 mules, a plow, a woman's wedding ring. Rachel's stomach turned. Then Charles pointed to a page near the back. S. Laramie. Beside Samuel's name was an amount marked, paid to keep quiet. Rachel looked at Charles. His face had gone white beneath the weathering. Sam was not stealing, she said. No, Charles whispered. He was paying for proof. At the bottom of the page, in Jonah's uneven hand, was one sentence. If I die, Grange and Holt killed more than me. Rachel covered her mouth. Outside, hoofbeats sounded. Charles closed the ledger and handed it to Rachel. Hide it under your shawl. Sheriff Grange rode into the yard with Deputy Mills and 2 men from town. Barnaby Holt sat a horse behind them, dry under a waxed coat, smiling like he had already counted the value of Rachel's stove. The sheriff dismounted. Morning, Widow Reeves, he called. We have come for what is owed. Charles stepped onto the porch beside her. Sheriff Grange's smile widened. Laramie, I hoped you would be here. The yard outside Rachel's cabin became a courtroom with no judge, a battlefield with no shots fired, and a test of every soul standing in the mud. Sheriff Grange unfolded a paper with theatrical care. By authority vested in me. Your authority does not cover theft, Charles said. The deputy shifted uneasily. Grange looked up, careful. A man with your family history should speak gently around accusations. Charles' jaw flexed, but he did not rise to the bait. Rachel stood on the porch with the ledger pressed beneath her shawl, its corners digging into her ribs. She could feel Jonah's handwriting like a coal against her skin. Part of her wanted to pull it out and throw it at the sheriff's feet. Another part knew a muddy yard, with Grange's men watching, was not the place. Evidence could disappear. People could be silenced. Charles seemed to know it too. You have a signed receipt granting 30 days, he said. I have a copy. Holt says he signed under pressure. Barnaby Holt lifted his chin. I feared violence. One of the town men coughed, perhaps remembering Charles in the saloon, still as stone, with no gun drawn. Rachel said, That is a lie. Sheriff Grange turned on her. Widow, you have lived on lies since your husband died. Charles moved one step forward, not enough to threaten, enough to stand between. Grange's eyes glittered. There it is, the gallant rancher defending his new charity case. Tell me, Laramie, does she pay in ledgers or kisses? The words struck Rachel so hard her face burned. Charles went very still. For one dangerous second, she thought he would hit the sheriff. A lesser man might have. A proud man certainly would have. But Charles only looked at Grange with a contempt so quiet it made the other man's smile falter. You shame your badge every time you speak, Charles said. Grange drew his revolver halfway. Rachel's heart stopped. Charles did not reach for his gun. Deputy Mills whispered, Sheriff. The air held. Then Grange pushed the revolver back into its holster and laughed. You are smarter than your brother was. That landed. Rachel saw it land. Charles's face changed, pain moving behind his eyes, like an animal in a cage. But he did not open the cage. Instead, he said, Mrs. Reeves, gather what you need. You will not stay here alone. I will not run from my home. You are not running. You are keeping safe until court. Sheriff Grange stepped forward. She's not going anywhere. Property under Caesar includes the widow until the debt is settled. Even Deputy Mills stared at him then. Charles's voice dropped. Say that again. Grange smiled. She is material to an investigation. No, Charles said. She is a free woman. Under my jurisdiction. Under God before that. The words were not loud, but something in made Rachel's eyes sting. Grange motioned to Deputy Mills. Take her. The deputy did not move. I said take her. Mills swallowed. He was a young man, soft-faced and frightened of the badge he served. Sheriff, I do not believe. Grange backhanded him hard enough to knock his hat into the mud. Charles came off the porch. This time he did move fast. He put himself squarely between Grange and the fallen deputy. His hand still did not touch his gun. Enough, Charles said. Grange's men reached for their rifles. Rachel stepped down from the porch. Stop. All eyes turned to her. Her voice shook, but it carried. I will go to town. Charles looked at her. Rachel, I will go, she said again. Not as prisoner, not as property. I will go to the Red Lantern Saloon, where Sheriff Grange first called me thief, and I will answer him before everyone who heard the charge. Grange's smile returned slowly. You think a speech will save you? No, Rachel said. I think truth might. Charles understood then. She saw it in his eyes. The ledger under her shawl. The saloon full of witnesses. The sheriff's own need for spectacle turned against him. It is a risk, he said quietly. Sel was getting in your wagon. Something tender passed through his face. Grange, hearing none of what mattered, gave a satisfied nod. Fie. We will have our public answer. Mercy Crossing can hear how a widow explains stolen money. They rode to town in a procession that drew people from doorways before they even reached Main Street. Rain threatened again. Low clouds stacked over the hills. Mud sucked at wheels. Dogs barked. Someone rang no bell. Yet the town gathered as if called. By the time Rachel stepped through the Red Lantern doors, the saloon was packed. It was the same room, same bar, same stove. Same stairs, same smoke and spilled whiskey and hungry eyes. But Rachel was not the same woman who had been dragged there. She was afraid. Fear had not left her. Courage, she was learning, was not the absence of fear. It was taking the next step while fear begged you to kneel. Charles entered behind her. Owen, Billy, and half the Laramie hands came too. Deputy Mills stood near the door, one cheek swelling. Barnaby Holt hurried behind the bar, whispering to anyone who would listen that the widow had been caught at last. Sheriff Grange climbed onto the low platform where musicians played on Saturday nights. Citizens of Mercy Crossing, he began, you all remember this woman's disgrace. Today, she has agreed to answer for the debts and suspected thefts tied to her late husband. Rachel looked at the faces, some hard, some curious, some ashamed. Mrs. Adler from the laundry stood near the stairs. Old Mr. Finch leaned on a cane. The mercantile owner, Amos Bell, twisted his hat in his hands. These were people who had watched her hunger and called it mystery, watched her shame and called it entertainment. Charles stood at her right shoulder, close but not touching. She drew strength from the space he gave her. Sheriff Grange pointed. Speak, Widow Reeves. Tell us where the money went. Rachel reached beneath her shawl and brought out Jonas' ledger. Barnaby Holt made a sound like a chair leg scraping. The sheriff's eyes sharpened. This, Rachel said, is my husband's ledger. I was afraid to read it. Then I was afraid to show it. I am still afraid. But I am more afraid of what happens if men like you keep wearing law like a coat over rotten flesh. The room stirred. Grange stepped down. Give me that. Charles moved slightly. No, the sheriff's hand hovered near his gun. You defying me again? Yes, Charles said. One word, no flourish. The saloon heard it. The whole room seemed to lean toward him. Sheriff Grange smiled coldly. Then I arrest you for obstruction. He grabbed Charles' arm. Owen started forward, but Charles lifted one hand to stop him. He let the sheriff bind his wrists. Rachel turned toward him, horrified. Do not, she whispered. Charles looked at her with a calm that broke her heart. Read it. That was what courage looked like. Not a man winning with fists. Not a gun cleared from leather. A man giving up his freedom so a woman's voice could be heard. Rachel opened the ledger, and she began to read. At first, Rachel's voice trembled so badly the numbers blurred. Then Mrs. Adler from the laundry stepped forward and stood beside her. No one had asked her to. She simply came, wiping her hands on her apron, her mouth tight with old anger. Read louder, Mrs. Reeves, she said. Some of us have been waiting years to hear it. Rachel looked at her, then down at the ledger. She read Barnaby Holt's initials beside the sale of a widow's plow. She read Titus Grand's initials beside a payment taken after charges were dropped against a freighter. She read the name of a miner whose mule had been seized, then sold to the sheriff's cousin. She read the name of Mrs. Adler's brother, who had lost his watch and team after a debt doubled in 1 week. The room changed as she read. Suspicion turned to recognition. Recognition turned to anger. Men who had looked away from Rachel's shame now looked at their own on the pages. Women whispered names of husbands, fathers, sons. Old Mr. Finch struck his cane once on the floor. That was my mule, he said. Barnaby Holt tried to slip toward the back door. Billy Shaw blocked him. Sheriff Grange shoved Charles forward. This is a dead man's scribbling. No court will take it. Deputy Mills, still holding his bruised cheek, stepped away from the door. His voice shook, but he spoke. I will take it to the circuit judge. Grange swung toward him. You will do what I tell you. No, Sheriff, Mills said. I do not think I will. A murmur rose. It was not loud enough yet to be victory, but it was too loud for fear. Grange drew his revolver. The saloon erupted in gasps. Charles, wrists bound, stepped in front of Rachel without hesitation, the gun pointed at his chest. Rachel felt the whole world narrow to that black barrel. Charles' bound hands, and the quiet set of his shoulders. He could not draw. He could not fight. He had made himself a shield because he knew Grange would rather shoot a man than be seen losing to a widow. "Move," Grange said. Charles did not. "You will die like your brother." Charles's face tightened, but his voice stayed steady. "My brother died telling the truth." Rachel stepped beside him, not behind, beside. "And if you shoot him," she said, "you will do it in front of the whole town." For a moment, Sheriff Grange seemed to remember the room, the witnesses, the faces no longer bent down in obedience. The saloon that had once served his cruelty had become a lantern. Amos Bell, the mercantile owner, spoke from the crowd. "Put the gun down, Titus." Then Mrs. Adler said, "Put it down." Old Mr. Finch lifted his cane. "Put it down." Owen Pike cocked his rifle from the doorway. "I would listen." Grange's hand wavered. Charles looked at him, and there was no triumph in his face, only sorrow and resolve. "It is over," Charles said. The sheriff's eyes darted toward the back door, but Billy still stood there with Barnaby Holt pinned by the collar. Deputy Mills drew his own revolver, not aiming at first, then raising it with both hands. "Sheriff Grange," Mills said, voice cracking but clear, "set down your weapon." The badge on Grange's chest caught the lamplight. For years, that badge had been enough to make people silent. Now it looked like a piece of tin. Slowly, with hatred twisting his mouth, Grange lowered the gun. No one cheered, not yet. The moment was too solemn for cheering. Deputy Mills took the revolver. Owen cut the rope from Charles' wrists. Rachel saw the red marks left there and had to fight the urge to take his hands in hers before everyone. Barnaby Holt began babbling about misunderstandings, forged entries, Jonah Reeves, bad memory, bad ink, anything that might save him. But Mrs. Adler had found her courage too, and courage, once seen, has a way of spreading. "You will explain it to the judge," she said. The circuit judge arrived 2 days later, brought early by a rider Charles sent through rain and mud. By then, Mercy Crossing had changed its posture. Not completely. Towns did not become righteous in a day, but something had cracked. Men who had joked at Rachel's expense crossed the street to avoid her eyes. Women brought testimony. Old papers appeared from trunks and flour tins. Deputy Mills, acting sheriff, until the judge ruled, locked Titus Grange in his own jail, with Barnaby Holt in the next cell. The ledger did what Rachel's tears never could. It gave shape to the wrong. It named it. It made it harder to deny. Jonah Reeves was not made into a saint. Rachel did not need that lie. He had borrowed money. He had gambled some. He had hidden truth from his wife when fear should have made him honest. But the ledger showed he had also tried, near the end, to gather proof. He had meant to speak. He had died before he could. That knowledge did not heal Rachel all at once. Healing was like home. It came by repeated motions. The court canceled the false debts. Rachel's cabin was restored to her free of Hull's claim. Several families received property or money from Hull's seized accounts. Sheriff Grange was sent under guard to the territorial seat to await trial for extortion, assault, and suspected murder in Samuel Laramie's case. Whether justice would reach all the way back to Samuel, Charles did not know, but for the first time in 4 years, his brother's name was spoken in town without shame. On the evening after the judge's ruling, Rachel returned to the Red Lantern. She did not go because she wished to remember the worst night of her life. She went because Mercy Crossing had called a town supper there, and Mrs. Adler insisted that places of shame ought to be made useful again. The saloon looked different with the card tables pushed aside and long boards laid across barrels for food. Lamps burned warm. Coffee replaced tea on the bar. Women set out pies. Men brought stew, bread, smoked ham, and beans that Billy proudly claimed he had not burned. Rachel arrived in her blue calico dress, the one she had bought with wages from the Laramie ranch. Her mother's ring shone on her finger, not as evidence, not as property, as inheritance of strength. When she entered, conversation dipped. For one breath, the old silence threatened. Then Mrs. Adler walked over and kissed Rachel's cheek. After that, people made room. Charles stood near the stove, speaking with Deputy Mills. His wrists had healed. His coat was clean. His hat was in his hand. When he saw Rachel, the guarded loneliness in his face eased in a way that made her chest ache. He came to her slowly. "Mrs. Reeves, Mr. Laramie." They looked at one another, both nearly smiling at the formality that had carried them safely through so much. Charles said, "I have something to ask you, if this is not too public a place." Rachel glanced around the saloon where her shame had been displayed, where his courage had been tested, where truth had finally stood upright. "Perhaps public places are not all bad, no," he said. "Perhaps not." He reached into his coat, and for one wild second Rachel thought of rings and proposals and every story women whispered over mending baskets. But he drew out an envelope, her wage envelope. She laughed softly. "You are paying me at a town supper." I did not want to be accused of poor bookkeeping. She took the envelope. It was thicker than usual. "Charles, there is a final accounting inside. The advance is paid. The shingles are paid. The feed for Juniper is paid, though I maintain she overcharges. The rest is yours." Rachel looked down at the envelope, then back at him. "And after final accounting, that is what I wish to ask." Around them, the supper continued, but the room seemed to soften at the edges. Charles held her gaze. "I need help at the ranch still. Not because my hands burn beans, though they do. Not because my ledgers are a disgrace, though they are. I need the kind of life that comes when you are there. I need the sound of your coffee pot in the morning, and your opinions on my accounts. I need someone who will tell me when I am being foolish and stand beside me when fear would be easier. But I will not offer you work when what I mean is a home." Rachel's eyes filled. He took a breath. "I am asking if you would let me court you proper, slow as you need, honest as I know how. And if one day you find you can trust me with more than your wages, I would count it the honor of my life to be your husband." No fiddle played. No one gasped. The moment was quiet enough for truth. Rachel thought of the woman she had been a month before, hungry in a leaking cabin, clinging to pride because it was the last possession no one had seized. She thought of Charles standing in rain, placing food on her porch as wages. Charles in the barn speaking Samuel's name. Charles in the saloon, wrists bound, stepping before a gun so her voice could finish reading. Love had not arrived like lightning. It had come like dawn, slow and undeniable, touching one edge of the world at a time until darkness had nowhere left to hide. "Yes," she said. Charles blinked, as if he had prepared for every answer, but the one he wanted most. Rachel smiled through tears. "You might court me, Charles Laramie. Slow, honest, with proper bookkeeping." A laugh moved through him, low and full of relief. Mrs. Adler, who had been pretending not to listen from 6 feet away, wiped her eyes and said, "About time." This time, the saloon did cheer, not loud and wild but warm. A sound of people choosing what kind of town they wanted to become. Months passed. Mercy Crossing did not turn perfect. No town ever did, but it turned. Deputy Mills was elected sheriff by men and women who had learned the cost of cowardice. Barnaby Holt's saloon changed hands and became a proper eating house under Mrs. Adler's management, though folks still called it the Red Lantern out of habit. The platform where Grange had accused Rachel became the place where children recited Christmas verses and ranch hands sang badly on Saturday nights. Rachel kept her cabin for a while. She needed to know she could. Charles never pressed. He rode with her, repaired fences, brought seed for her garden, and listened when grief returned in sudden weather. By spring, the cottonwoods leafed silver-green along the creek. Rachel married Charles beneath them with Juniper tied nearby. Wearing a wreath of wildflowers she tried to eat. Owen stood with Charles. Mrs. Adler stood with Rachel. Deputy Mills, wearing his new badge like a responsibility instead of a weapon, signed the certificate as witness. After the wedding supper, Charles took Rachel home to the Laramie Ranch. Not as a charity case. Not as a widow under debt. Not as a woman rescued once and expected to be grateful forever. As wife, the ranch house had changed by then. Curtains at the windows, herbs drying from the rafters, a shelf for Rachel's Bible and her mother's pressed flowers, ledgers stacked neatly, a blue quilt on the bed, coffee ready for morning. At sunset, Charles and Rachel stood on the porch while the sky burned rose and gold over the western flats. The cattle moved like shadows in the distance. The wind carried the smell of rain, sage, and supper cooling on the table. Charles took her hand carefully, as if still honoring every hurt that had taught her caution. Rachel leaned against him. "Do you ever think of that night?" she asked. "The saloon? Yar. Where's the lunch?" He looked toward the fading town lights, barely visible beyond the road. "I think of it. So do I." His tummy moved gently over her ring. "I wish I had stood sooner." Rachel shook her head. "You stood when it mattered." He turned to her. "So did you." The last light caught his face, the scar at his jaw, the tenderness he no longer tried to hide. Rachel thought of the whole saloon watching him defy a sheriff or a widow. No one wanted to defend. They had learned what courage looked like that night. Yes, but so had she. Courage looked like a man who would not draw first. Courage looked like a woman reading the truth with shaking hands. Courage looked like a town ashamed enough to change. Courage looked like accepting love without surrendering dignity. And as Charles Laramie opened the ranch house door, and Rachel Reeves Laramie stepped inside beside him, the warm lamplight spilled across the porch and out into the dark, bright enough to guide anyone still looking for home.